Over 1 in 5 school children in England now speak English as an additional language, and we know that teachers often feel unprepared to teach children who are new to English or who understand the curriculum but don't yet have the language to access it. In Ofsted's updated framework, they've reintroduced a dedicated section on EAL, and schools will need to know and understand how to meet this new requirement. Inspectors are actually being explicitly asked to consider how schools support pupils at the early stages of learning English. EAL learners are a highly diverse group with varying abilities and needs, and evidence has shown that it is their proficiency in English which has the most direct impact on their attainment at school, and so schools must bear this in mind when thinking about their pupils' language level and how they can provide the right integrated and targeted support.
Well, since 2012, EAL hasn't featured in the various frameworks that have been published. It's disappeared from the policy agenda and consequently from Ofsted. When Ofsted consulted for the new framework in February 2025, they did put in one reference to EAL, but when the final version was published, that was removed, and instead there are now 6 references to EAL in the toolkit. They're calling it a toolkit now rather than a handbook. So that means that EAL is back on the agenda again with those six bulleted statements. Many schools will look at those criteria and think that's something we do already. But there will be other schools, perhaps there may not be an EAL coordinator, or they're not doing some of the things on there. We'll have to consider some of those aspects in those 6 statements. For example, the first one talks about knowing that pupils may speak more than one language. So that means that schools will need to know their pupils. They'll need to know about the languages they speak. They'll need to know if they're literate, how fluent they are in those languages, how fluent they are in English. Now Ofsted is saying that schools should be assessing the fluency of pupils. The heading talks about pupils at the early stages of English. So that isn't too clear at the moment. They have clarified subsequently, not in the toolkit, but they have clarified that that doesn't necessarily mean the DFE scales, because they're no longer mandatory. There may be some schools who don't have an EAL lead or EAL coordinator. There isn't a statutory responsibility for schools to have one. That's up to schools, whether there's a director of inclusion or a senior leader that has oversight across a range of other responsibilities. That's in contrast to special educational needs, where the SENCO has to be a qualified teacher, has to have a recognised national qualification. That requirement isn't in place for EAL. So inspectors will come across a range of different models where there may be a coordinator who is a teaching assistant, for example, and they will want to speak to a leader, probably, rather than to a teaching assistant who's not a line manager or leader, to find out how the school approaches EAL. I think the only way you can demonstrate it is maybe through their work and say, well, when they first arrived, here's an example of what they could or couldn't do, and now 6 months later, this is what they're doing. So I think the pupils' work is going to be key, and possibly speaking to pupils as well. If they do speak to, in the case sampling, people who arrived as a new arrival, new to English 6 months ago, and they're now having a conversation with them. But that's the only way really you're going to be able to get underneath that. Ofsted doesn't have a view about how pupils should be taught. So Ofsted doesn't come with an agenda about this is what you should look for. But it's possible that inspectors, based on their experience or lack of experience, may have a different view. So they really do need to just make sure that they stick to the toolkit and not come in with a view. For example, whether pupils are being taken out of a lesson to receive additional support. That might be a good thing, and there may be a good rationale for it. But if pupils are being routinely withdrawn from a lesson, then they're missing access to the curriculum. So I think they need to be able to ask the questions of why something is happening and then be able to evaluate the response they get to that.